Less or more? Good? Okay. If I don't, yeah, give me a signal if I don't drift off. But anyway, yeah, this collection up front I want to talk about first. It covers a massive amount of time, pretty much. Anywhere from 12,000 years ago right up until maybe 500 years ago. So please take a look at it. Usually I bring some stuff for people to look at, but I want you all to look at that because it represents a really good picture of what you would encounter up there as an archaeologist. But it is a good representation of the cultures that have been, and when I say cultures, I don't mean different cultures, but a continuum of cultures that basically, in my view, the same people that started off here a long, long time ago were the same people that were last here, Indigenous people. So when you look at that, it's also, bear in mind, as Sharon mentioned, it was put together by a man named E.J. Carter. We call him Jack Carter. He was a local lawyer, and it's from an era when collecting was kind of an acceptable thing, which really isn't so much the case anymore because it was not done in a structured way, and it just wasn't very respectful, I'll put it that way. But nowadays we have these materials, so as an archaeologist or as a public, you can look at them and kind of understand these folks a little more. And all of this material up here came from right around here. And so one of the things you'll see up there, and some of the dating is on that. Dr. Rush put on it. My colleague Dr. Rush put some of the dates on that, so you'll see. But some of the pottery up there is from people that you probably know as the Iroquois or whatnot, but it's the Haudenosaunee people, right? And those were the last folks that fully occupied our landscape, right? So if you, and there's a little bit of, I don't want to say controversy, but a little bit of difference in terms of how these folks that live right here where we are interpreted. But the way I interpret them is that in the archaeology world, we can look at the ceramics that belong to the 5 nations, and we can look at the ceramics we find here, and there's a little bit of difference. So it doesn't mean they were different people. It just means that they had a, they might have been signifying on that pottery, hey, this is where I live. We don't know. They didn't tell us. Unfortunately, because when we have the first European show up down in Montreal zone, right, Cartier, he finds a river valley full of people, right? All kinds of descriptions of small, in their terms, European kingdoms, etc. But we all know it's just village sites or different groupings of villages. And 50 years later or whatnot, 60 years later, when people show up, more Europeans, explorers, this area basically isn't full of these peoples anymore. Not really sure exactly why. I don't have a definitive answer, but there's a lot of theories as to why, and it was a combination of a lot of things, pretty sure. And so some of that I want to talk about. So when we look at different ways of looking at archaeology, one of them is we take different elements of, say, on a piece of pottery, and just think of assigning a number to that element. And if we see that same element on this piece of pottery on something that's over from the 5 nations or from the Hurons, we can connect them, right? So they do this process, it's a very convoluted thing called social network analysis, all right? But what it told us is that the Haudenosaunee people living here were playing an important role in terms of mediating, or sometimes it's called different things, but essentially they were the middlemen between the 5 nations groups and the Huron, Northern Iroquois groups. And this kind of status went on for quite a good period of time. And it's very interesting because in the archaeology on the ground, you could see this, right? I mean, and actually that's what I was interpreting before I even saw this study, so it's pretty cool. But what it showed is that folks here were actually the middlemen, the kind of thing, they mediated. So something happened though, and some kind of event happened, and we don't know, but dating wise it was somewhere 1500 to 1550. Some kind of event occurred that ended this role that the people right here played, and you sort of have this retraction where the groups are no longer right on the river, they're not basically close to the larger bodies of water, they kind of moved inland a little bit. But but then they quickly, basically, kind of, I don't wanna say disappear, because that's not the right term, but they hid out, right? In other words, in 1550, we had 5 to 6 groups of people living in this part of the county, northwest Jefferson County, and maybe down through Sandy Creek, which constitutes a large amount of people. And by the time you get into the 1600 though, there's a couple of scattered villages kind of tucked away here and there. And that's kind of, if you think about, that's the time when European contact is, all hell breaks loose when, you know, us white people show up, of course. But, so, a bunch of serious events, right? But unfortunately for us archaeologists, we can't, unlike we go to the Akwesasne, we could go to the Seneca, we can get their oral traditions of huge timelines. But we don't have the people that necessarily we know were living here and continued on. We know that the people that were here didn't disappear. They went and they lived with their families, their clan members, which were the 5 nations, probably some were people right across the river, because these people are all related, right? They all spoke the same general language, but that's kind of what happened to these folks up here, as far as we can piece together. Probably a combination of warfare, right? It could have been warfare or something that was triggered by climate, etc. We don't know. But in reality, when you look at the timeline closest, what I see myself is in, I think, don't get me on the dates, but it's like 1534, I think, is when Cartier shows up. All right, and he shows up, sees this massive amount of people, etc. And they more or less, you know, bring them in, welcome them, etc. And I want you to imagine, right, this is the first European they've seen, right, and they're like, wow, this is amazing, you know, and whatever, trinkets, blankets, whatever, you know, hand it out, and what's the first thing you want to do is you're going to, man, I'm going to go down, I'm going to go to the next village and tell, you know, my clan member so-and-so, this is what happened, look at, there's the proof. And that possibly becomes a disease vector, right? And could have carried disease right down the river. Anybody that's from around here knows that the river is a road of travel. It's not a barrier. So I suspect that played a large role in it. Not really sure, but it's something that's being worked on over time, right? And so when the first settlers show up here, well, one of the earliest guys, I don't know if you've ever familiar with Sixbury Lake. It's one of the lakes over in Redwood. It's named after a guy named Sixbury. Well, he escapes servitude, bondage, and, you know, late 1700s. He beats feet up here, and what's he do? He doesn't come find a settlement up in this area. No, he's on the run. He's on the lam, more or less, from some guy that wants him to keep working for him for nothing. But anyway, he ends up staying at a Native American village right where essentially Evans Mills is, in a bend in the Indian River. And now that was the late 1700s. So that's the very first early people that came up here actually had a relationship with the people that were living here, the indigenous folks that were living here, the Native Americans, which is pretty interesting. Parrish married one, right? We're all familiar with Parrishville, right? And there's a deep connection also from the Black River Valley up through for the Oneida Nation. You've got a deep connection from the Mohawk Nation coming down the river, and also the Onondaga Nation coming up the lake. So they all kind of meet where we are, which is kind of reflective of the fact that the people that were here during that period probably were all part of the same family. In fact, now we've learned through dating and etc. that if you wanted to go back in time about let's say 1400 AD, right? You would have seen 1 or 2 bands of people. I don't want to use the word, groups of people, right? So 1 or 2 village groups, something like this. But then in a short, rapid amount of time, by you get to 1500, now we've got 6 groups. There's all kinds of people living here. We believe that you had a big influx of people from the Haudenosaunee nations, from the Huron nations, right? Because they didn't necessarily see themselves as enemies at that time. In fact, the Oneidas have a tradition of with terms of the Huron at a certain point, after the Rev War and stuff, they welcomed the Hurons as long lost brothers, right? So these people didn't necessarily see things the same way as we do, as you know, because we're goofy, right? But its clan was key, and I think that was at the core of these folks here, and how they kind of relate to the modern, what we think of as the modern nations. So what's really interesting too is that about the same time that we had this blossoming of Haudenosaunee people here, there was actually drought issues and other things going across the Northeast. And if you think about it, where most, well, you don't know, but where most of these villages are, they're right next to either a major stream or a major body of water, et cetera, and you're not gonna run out of water. For irrigation, you're not gonna run out of water where we are. So that's probably a large measure of why these folks just like, wow. You know, and if you were one of the folks already living here, you're like telling your relation, your clan member, hey, I know it was a bad year, guys, come on up here. We got more fish than you could ever catch, and we got lots of corn. So I think that's kind of the core of it. And what's really interesting is that we have up here, archaeologists call it a culture which isn't a separate culture, it's the same people, prior to what I call the classic Iroquoians, right? In Canada, they call them ancestral Iroquoians, and that's how I refer to them. But in America, for some reason, we call them Point Peninsula people, okay? And it's named after Point Peninsula out here. And these people kind of fit this time frame before the classic Iroquoian period, right? And what's neat is that that's kind of when we start seeing agricultural activities happen. And in the archaeological record, you kind of see Point Peninsula, you first start seeing, okay, these people are paying attention to areas that help them grow, but they're still right on the water. And then the next kind of, there's a brief period that it's called different things in different places, but up here it's referred to as Pillar Point. It's this little segment of time, maybe this 100 years or so, between Point Peninsula people and the classic Iroquoian, where their pottery starts really changing a lot. You know, it's not like that, but it's, wow, they started doing stuff so that, you know, by the time you get into 1400, as an archaeologist, you can look at the stream and go, wow, that's early, you know, Iroquoian stuff. But it's all one people, and what's interesting is it wasn't until the very end of things, when you had the classic Iroquoian period, did people change their lifestyle very much for, you know, over 10,000 years. What I mean by that is that the materials that we find, right, in that date range are all in the same locations, right? They're all on the islands, they're all on the shorelines, they're all in these same kind of zones, right? In other words, there's very few examples of what's called a singular component site. Fancy archaeology term, it just means there was only one group that occupied this spot for one period of time. Up here, you're much more likely to find an area that's been occupied over and over and over. We'll find materials from archaic right into woodland times. And what I mean, just back up a little bit, woodland, think of people starting agriculture. They're basically making pottery, all right? And archaic is this very long period of time where that's kind of where the classic, you know, hunter-gatherer kind of image comes from. Not super accurate, but. And then paleo is very early, so it's like older than 10,000 years, maybe 9,000 in our area. And that's, you know, end of the Ice Age stuff, right? So, but the neat thing is that from that very period of time, right up until the very end of things, which is when the latest occupation of the Iroquoian folks, you find the stuff in the same places, right? Which tells me one thing, resource harvesting, right? And if you really think about it, these people were fishermen, why wouldn't you be? I mean, gosh, you got all kinds of fish here. I mean, if you think about it, every single stream Even the little ones you see that dry up now, they would have had salmon runs up them. We would have had all kinds of stuff, and I don't know if you're too familiar with the Shimo Bay. It was famous for the ciscos, the whitefish. Now, you go over there, and of course it's all these flat limestone shelves. There's that whole terrain out there, and it creates these shallow beds of flat limestone that's just this far under the water. And what would happen is that, unlike most fish, the ciscos actually spawn in late fall, early winter. Late November, early winter. And which is the only thing going on at that point in time, right? But what it means is they spawn in those same shallow zones. So if you go over now on the shorelines over Point Peninsula and around Shimo Bay, these areas, you will find net sinkers. We call them expedient net sinkers because they're basically a flat pebble that looks like this, but it's flat, and there's two notches out of it to hold your string on, and they would tie cordage on it and basically use these nets just to harvest ciscos. You can imagine how much you could get in one swat like that. So these people were basically well stocked with marine resources. And it's just really neat because we can see this starting in the earliest site we have identified. It was identified by colleague Dr. Rush, Lawyer Rush, on Fort Drum on the shorelines of the glacial lake, right? Because if you were to come here 13,000 years ago, you better hold your breath because we'd be under about 300 and some feet of water, right? Give or take. So at that time, the shoreline's like 600 feet sea level. They identified a paleo shoreline, and sure enough, they identified a site where people are actually building boats there at that point in time. So imagine looking out over a lake that's just no horizon on that baby. It's just nothing but big water and ice and frozenness. And here's these people hanging out, doing their thing. And that is, at least 13,000 years ago. It might push a little bit later. All the dating on things, the farther back in time you go, the more it kind of changes around. It's one of those things. But the big thing is that, as from what I've seen, from 50 years of monkeying around with this, that pattern of marine resource and coastal living never changes. It really doesn't. And in fact, if you think about it, even the Iroquois populations, they were just inland. A bunch of them were just at the headwaters of French Creek, right? A bunch of them on Sandy Creek. I mean, they're all within a proximity of water bodies or large streams, Black River, all that kind of stuff. So they never really changed that lifestyle until the last. But really, I think the change became more of an issue of agriculture, right? I mean, now they could supply themselves with more and more agricultural products and growing, et cetera, and that kind of thing. And that's kind of all ties in with the blossoming of the Haudenosaunee culture into what most people nowadays think of, right? The Three Sisters, right? And actually, squash was here first. Squash was been identified, and this is what's really interesting in archaeologists, is the new technologies they come out with. It's like geeky stuff, but it's neat. So they took, and I don't know if I'm using the right word, metate, I think, or it's a grinding stone, all right? They've out of a site, and plants have a skeleton of silica, right? And so it leaves these skeletons out. Well, they were able to take and somehow extract these off the surface of this rock and look at them and determine what plants were being used. And so that's how we got these really pretty accurate and old dates and things. So squash, yeah, I mean, you're talking thousands of years ago, right? And corn was next, right? And beans are actually the very last one, which is surprising to archaeologists. I mean, I don't remember the dates. It's less than 1,000 years though. So it's you can see that in our area, right? These people that were totally a marine-oriented people basically blossomed into a form of Haudenosaunee that was basically I would call them a coastal Haudenosaunee. I mean, the closest thing you'll see now is the Akwesasne, right? They're living right on the water, right? So it's very interesting to an archaeologist because we're able to see this transition like this. Most places, you kind of lose a lot of that distance of time. But what's neat is that this chunk of ground actually came out of the water from that glacial lake pretty early on, and we've been able to find evidence of it, all along. And even evidence in the surrounding areas like Lake Champlain, all right? Because if you went back that 13,000 years, think of that lake draining down in the space of a couple hundred years. That's drastic, right? Whoosh, it comes down. Well, it goes down, and about that time, the ocean comes in, right? And the ocean's now down by Ogdensburg, and there's seal hunting happening down there. There's ocean shell harvesting happening in Ogdensburg. All right, you can literally map out where the ocean was by the sediment cores taken all over the place. Ottawa Valley was part of the ocean. Champlain Valley was part of the ocean, and there was actually a site located in the uplands of Champlain Valley that's, they were hunting beluga whales. Yeah, I mean, whale hunting, right? So in other words, we could all get together and let's go on a whale hunt. We'll be gone for a couple of weeks, and we'll paddle back upstream with a bunch of whale meat. I mean, it's hard to fathom, but that is kind of the thing. Our landscape's gone through a ton of changes, but really, we really, the people have always been sticking around here, right? You could find these stuff from a million different sites from bunches of ages, but it really shows in a bigger picture that there's people, as soon as the ice left, Native Americans were living here, and that's a long time ago, and it really wasn't until 500 years ago or less that the strong presence of people on our area kind of left, so to speak. So it is, for an archaeologist, really a fascinating subject. But in this display case over here, just while I'm thinking of it, you'll see what I'm talking about. If you take a look, you'll see what's archaeologists call classic Iroquois pottery. It has a developed collar, right? And then you'll see stuff that's decorated up near the top edge, kind of a little bit different. Well, that's that pillar point stuff. And then you'll see some older looking, thicker, heavier stuff, and that's what we call pillar point. And pillar point is a name applied to a cultural, I don't know the term, because I hate using the word culture, because it's not a different, it's one thing, right? But that's applied to a big swath around the Great Lakes, actually. And it's all based on right over here, right? Over on Chameau Bay, the Pillar Point. And years ago, I was able to do a bunch of investigating over there, and what we realize now, and I actually got the geoarchaeologist from New York State Museum, Dr. Rush, a bunch of people, my friend Jesse Bergevin from the United Nations, a bunch of people, and we were out and be able to do a good examination of this area. And what we've learned is that it's basically a ceremonial stone landscape, which for us, Europeans, that's like a church spread out all over the place, right? On a piece of land. I mean, important sacred things that had uses that we don't really fathom yet. And some of them are definitely involving, burial situations, that kind of things. So you'll note I won't speak too much about things like that, just simply because it's not really respectful, but there is essentially a platform mound there, all right? Just like you picture, in the Ohio Valley, or whatever, about 15 feet high and about the size of a football field, all right? Previously, it was not thought much of, other than it was a place where, you'd go digging Indian stuff, in the early part of last century, and it was noted as, just a knob or a hill or something like this. But it turns out, I got a chance to do some investigation. In the first visit out there, the gentleman, the owner of the property, he's driving around one of these dune buggy looking things that's way up off the ground, and I kind of freaked him out because I jumped off the back when I saw this. You know, I'm like, wow. So so you had that, and we found a series of stone constructions that have certain alignments, things like that. There's a really crazy looking stone construction that's sort of an S-shaped thing that's, we're not sure what's going on, but it's kind of fortuitous that they named this culture after this cultural period after the Pillar Point or Point Peninsula, because it is some kind of really important sacred kind of site, you know. It really is. At some point I hope to get together with my colleague Jesse and put together a paper on it that I can release to the public. What I've done now is I just can't really, it's for the nations, it's not for the public. So, but we've got a lot of crazy stuff like that in our time period continuum, right? I've been working also on another stone construction in a different area, right? Because see, up here, when we're all grown up, they're told the natives up here, they didn't build anything out of stone, you know. It's like, what are you, dumb? You don't think they can't build, I just, you know, it's the ridiculous thought, right? So what we've learned is that if you're all familiar with the terrain around here, there's a lot of flat limestone. What's it good for a farmer? Nothing, right? He's like, can't even pasture my cows in there. So it usually gets cut for wood lot or whatever. It's relatively low disturbance level in the landscape. What we found is that there's some ceremonial stone features on that still left. A good example is over on the Perch Lake Wildlife Management Area. There's the Perch Lake Mounds that many people have heard of. They're kind of these constructions, they look like a big donut, maybe 30 feet across or more. Some of them are very low to the ground, like a foot or two. Some of them were several feet high. They're all sitting on this limestone terrain, right? They're all kind of off the edge of usable agricultural land, so they survived, which is really cool. So using that same thing, we were looking around and yeah, I located one feature that it appears to be some type of a serpentine construction. It's, I don't know how long, it's about 150 meters, which is, I don't know how many yards that is, but that's long, right? It's a couple of football fields or something, I don't know. But, and it's like 5 or 6 feet high, maybe 8 feet wide, and it just goes whoop, right up like this. And it's in a pretty crazy place. So it's, yeah, there's stuff right here that people have not discovered or not understood when they looked at it, right? So it's only now that we're really realizing that in this long period of time of people living here, they were doing all kinds of stuff, you know. On my own property, which is right above the heights above French Creek, south side, there's what technically is a boulder arrangement. It's some kind of an arrangement of very large glacial erratics into it's both I think pointing at different alignments for astronomical events or solar events or lunar events, but it also appears to be a effigy of some type. In other words, it looks very bird-like. And there's also a low mound behind this one giant rock that appears to be likely associated with a burial. So there's something going on there, but it's stuff that as a kid growing up here on a farm, you walk right by. There's some rocks. My eyes really got opened up about, I don't know, it must have been 20 or 30 years ago when Dr. Rush at Fort Drum invited me out to look at something called the calendar site, right? I'm thinking, oh man, you know, Mayan calendar, you know, stuff, you know, this kind of thing. And she takes me out to this field, it's all sand, these pine barrens out there. And she goes, well, what do you think? And I'm looking at some big rocks. And I'm like, what? But once I understood, it was basically a gathering of very large glacial erratics, about as tall as I am, right? Big ones. And And it wasn't like the rocks are pointing at something. It was the spaces between the rocks lined up with different things. And then when they uncovered the ground around this, they found perfect, it's all sand, they found perfect post molds, right? Which is a black stain in the ground that shows you where to put a post in. And what they determined after plugging all these things in, it's like, this is pointing towards, the sunrise on a solstice, this is pointing towards, a lunar eclipse, all this, it's like, wow, a ton of information. And she actually finally put the stamp of approval of what it was by inviting the Mohawk elders from the Akwesasne down to tell her, what am I looking at? And that's what they told her. And so it's pretty amazing. So that stuff's still out here. And it's neat because, they say, like, keep your eyes peeled. You never know, right? I mean, I had a farm trail that's on our farm that I've driven a tractor on for I don't know how long, walked on it, done everything on it, screwed around on it, right? And over the years it gets a little washed out, but I want to say, and this is something that happened about 10 years ago, for maybe 20 years, every time I go out there, I'm like, what the heck did my father have a piece of black water line out there for? And my father, you have to know, he'd leave weird stuff all over the woods, right? I found a chainsaw out in the woods once. Okay. But anyway, so there's this little chunk of black water. You all seen the black shiny water line, right? It's just stuck in the bag. What is he doing with that? So there's a broken headlight out there. There's weird stuff, right? Well, my kid's out back with us. We have a little hunting camp out in the backwoods there, and he comes out. He's talking. So I gotta walk back out. He comes running back down the trail. About 10 minutes later, he's like, can't even talk. I'm like, what is wrong? I thought he hurt himself. He opens up his hand, and that black piece of water line was a spearhead, right?
Wow.
And it's like, whoa. So I run up the trail, right? And we had to go find the little tip of it. And it was like, yeah, it was a big deal. But it taught me a lot of things. Number one, open up your eyes, dummy. But it also was located on this limestone terrain, right? This, what I call limestone terrain, is flat limestone, that the very shallow soil to nothing, which opened my eyes up to another thing that we have, or another really, really big, important resource that people don't consider. Now, if anybody knows deer or any kind of other animal that you would use for sustenance, they thrive on open areas, right? Edge zones, the edge of the woods, right? Flooded beaver meadows dried up, those kinds of things. Well, if you've ever been in real woods, like up in Canada or up there where there's deep woods, there's nothing there but trees, and there's not even that many squirrels, right? There's no feed, there's no browse. So if we go back 500 years ago, okay, and when you drive around, you see these flat limestone areas, right? They wouldn't have been covered with honeysuckle and buckthorn and all the other crap that Europeans brought over with us, right? They would have been open, right? They would have been grasslands, what we call savannas with low shrubbery, some tall shrubs, which are basically those junipers that get stunted. And this is what the Chameau Barrens, it's called the Alvar, right? And those things are, what you have to imagine is what we call them is islands of prairie in a sea of primeval forest, right? So that's where all the animals were. That's where all the deer were. That's where all the turkey were. That's where all of your gathering plants, right? Whether it's berries, any kind of thing like that, it's gonna be growing out there. So that's the other resource that these people had tremendous access to at all times. They didn't have to do like what's traditionally done in a lot of areas, burning, right? You go through and you burn so that you could generate open areas. That's common practice, in many cultures. Here they didn't even need to. They say, no, we're just gonna go over here and harvest a whole bunch of deer. In fact, one site on Pillar Point, you wouldn't believe the amount of deer antler that was on this one site. And the Haudenosaunees here didn't use flint for their arrows. They used bone, all right? I believe mostly because they had a buttload of it, right? I mean, a lot of antlers. And the thing of it is, if I take a piece of flint on an arrow and I shoot it and it hits something hard, it's gonna go. If I shoot it with a piece of bone point, it's gonna bounce off. and you're more than likely to be able to reuse the unit. And if you don't have a lot invested in it, not like you would with a piece of flint, because around here, flint or chert is not readily available. We have Black River chert, but it's spotty as to what we call nappable. You could turn it into something. So some archaeologists believe it might have been a time of strife, and the sources, like it's called Onondaga chert, there's a lot of it downstate. These folks up here couldn't get that because they didn't like each other, but I don't buy that at all. I mean maybe, but I think it's because they had an abundance of deer antler. I mean, holy cow. They're like I say, these were prairie, and it's like, wow, there's a lot. And it's remarkable how much deer antler from this one site that appears to be a site where they were making these points, because I've got all the stages, right? Here's a tine off of an antler. This is how they cut it off, right? The next one is, this is how they started shaping it. This is how they started right all up to a finished little cone-shaped point that would tuck right on the end of a shaft, right? So deer, they had a lot of it. In fact, they did find a report, historic report. There was a crazy guy named Rogers, who had Rogers Rangers. He was this British guy, right? First Green Beret type guy. He was a nutcase, right? But he was like rugged dude, right? He was on some mission to fight with the French or something, I don't recall, but he was over another county over, right? And him and his men got stuck there in the winter. Now, they're all starving because they're over there in the deep woods. So he gathers a couple of guys, and they make snowshoes out of whatever they had, and they march to Jefferson County to harvest deer to bring back to his men. That tells you something, if they're marching that far to come here to harvest deer, because that's where all the deer were. So that's a big deal, right? And another interesting thing, I gotta look at the clock, because I want to leave a few minutes so people can ask me questions. But another thing is, right after the time period when we had the Champlain, it's called the Champlain Sea, when the ocean was at Ogdensburg, right? Well, and this is all rapid succession, so that's like 11,000 years ago, maybe 1,000 years after the great giant lake goes whoof, right? We got the ocean hanging out and everything. All of a sudden, everything starts drying up, big time. All right. In fact, Niagara Falls stops being Niagara Falls. The glaciers that are north of us stop feeding it. All right. So all of a sudden, Lake Ontario doesn't have anything feeding it, except for all these smaller tributaries, and it becomes landlocked. It no longer flows out the St. Lawrence River, right? And if you were to go to Cape Vincent, you'd have to walk past Charity Shoals, a couple miles, right, to get to the shore of the lake. And if you were to go to Cape Vincent, you'd be somewhere between Tibbetts and Carlton Island. You'd be looking at a waterfall. St. Lawrence is flowing backwards, because once the Niagara River shut off, you all know where Trent River is over at Kingston. All that glacial meltwater is coming down the Trent River now and pouring and filling up the river. So there was this period of time called the Glacial Lake Low Stand, or not glacial, the Lake Low Stand. And it's where all the Great Lakes, a little bit different time periods and a little bit different impacts, basically all dropped hundreds of feet, all right? All of them. In fact, Lake Huron becomes two separate bodies of water, all right? It's amazing when you think about it. So you had this really dry period of time. It's a lot to do with the melting glaciers and et cetera, and the climatic changes that generate a real dry climate. But as far as the evidence we have, okay, you still had water flowing in to the lake from tributaries like the Black River and other areas, the St. Lawrence, right? So, but the lake was landlocked. And that's, if you all know about the story about the landlocked salmon that was the indigenous species that was here when Europeans showed up before we killed them all off like idiots. They were landlocked because of this period of time. There became a time where they couldn't swim out to the ocean like salmon do. So that's where this develops, right? This is like 10,000 years ago. But it was crazy because at that period of time, you also had what's called the Great Plains expansion. The prairies spread out over that sunken lake shore, that dry lake shore, right? So now picture all this miles of shoreline surrounding the lakes is now prairie, right? And in fact, we have plants right over here in Chameau, on the Chameau Barrens, that they're the only place they exist this side of the Great Plains, right? The prairie smoke. That got there during this period of time. Eventually, things started shifting, and that's why they were left here. They're a remnant paleo population. But during that period of time, we also had a caribou herd running through here. We had caribou migration, right? Just like you would have seen in Alaska or wherever. Oh yeah, no, they came through. We had herds of caribou coming through at this point in time. They came, and no matter what, they had to get across this river because it looks as though they had breeding grounds or summering grounds in the north, across the river. Okay, and there's two places we can clearly identify why we can say this with absolute certainty. There's a certain type of spear point that is made by the people in the Great Plains, the caribou hunters of the Great Plains. Okay, and I'm not saying that the people necessarily, but that technology is a clear indication of caribou hunting. Now, there's two places we found these points. One is over on Gordon's Island, right across the river, and the other is down by the Akwesasne. It shows us that these are the 2 points where these caribou were crossing, right? And these are the 2 points where Native Americans were just harvesting or whatever. And what I like to say is that it had to involve an interaction with the people that were here, even if these were hunters following these herds, because hunters following herds wouldn't have been boat people, right? And the folks that lived here were boat people. They lived and breathed by their canoe. I mean, I guess one of the best examples I can tell you is that when I was a kid, I did spend a couple summers in a canoe survival camp in northern Canada. Taught me an awful lot. Not only how to light a fire with one match, or you don't get in your supper, but, or rub 2 sticks, that was a little harder. But anyway, it taught me to look at life from a canoe. Everything changes. Everything changes. We think of everything in terms of, hey, if I want to get over there, I'm going to hop in my car and drive over there. I'm going to point A to B, get on to 81 and cruise. I want you to think about people that lived in a massive forest world, and they lived by their canoe. All right, especially in our region. We're a coastal region. Everywhere you look, there's water, right? And trust me, if that water is this deep, I can float my canoe down it or up it. And that's still easier than moving something on my back, right? And it's still easier to follow water courses than it is to do our, white guy thing and pull out my compass, go, I'm gonna march through the woods this way. No, you don't. If you hold up a map of the watersheds in our region, there's your grid. There's your map grid for how people navigated the landscape. I mean, face it, we don't have a lot of landmarks, right? Pretty flat terrain. It was all the watersheds, right? You get any rough familiarity with the watersheds, then you know, okay, I follow this one, you know where you're gonna go. Around here, you're either gonna end up in the lake or the river. About it, right? It's very interesting because the points where watersheds, this way goes the lake, this way goes the river, right in there. Interesting enough, we find native sites. They knew what they were doing. They knew. But looks like I got about 15 minutes left, so I was gonna actually open up to questions if you all, because people usually have questions. And but anyway, there you go. Thank you. That was my sort of talk. I'll go right to this young lady in the back first.
I live in the Utica area, and the Haudenosaunee they have a museum there of their culture. Do they have any knowledge or any remembrance in there? And I've been there, but I can't remember because I've talked to them about why they ended up there versus up here.
Well, it's a long story, but it's still. I mean, it doesn't answer the question of getting at a tradition of oral connection,
right?
In terms of oral memory, right? Because that's Akwesasne is a traditional place to be, right? Anyway, so but again, the one thing we don't have is that direct hand-me-down. We do have things alluding to it and stuff. The Onondaga have a tradition that they came up out of the ground at a tributary spring right by, Sandy Creek.
Right.
So we do have bits and pieces. The other interesting thing is you go anywhere in New York State, and if you're a goofy white guy, you can't pronounce the names unless you live there, right? Because they're all Native Americans and we don't know the language.
Right.
The closest name you'll get is go that way to hit the Oswegatchie, right? Where is those names in Jefferson County? It's a tell as to what was here when Europeans showed up, right? We do have a few names. We do record it. Chameau Bay zone is I won't even try to pronounce the name, is the place where they came to smoke tobacco, which is a sacred religion, sacred ritual type of thing. And French Creek area was known as the place where the fort fell. Give or take that translation. If you were to go across the river over to the Mohawk Reservation, you would find the place where the Peacemaker was born. So we do have some traditional names in our area. It's just nobody was nice enough to name anything after them. So.
I think I can kind of address that issue because down in the Mohawk Valley in the Utica area, that's where we came from.
Right.
If you look at the Confederacy across what's today New York State, we were all lined up in a row all the way across. So we had, because there was a lot of interaction, but we were also migratory too. And if you look in the new archaeological exhibit case, there's a map there that shows you like the original lands of the Mohawks and the Senecas and so on. So we were migratory, we moved up and down. We didn't just always stay in one place.
Was it more moving by seasons or?
Probably by seasons and hunting, the fishing, the weather, and again, you were forced out of a lot of places as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the other thing is that we kind of have a different concept of the land, I think, in terms of our Eurocentric view, right? And so, first of all, a lot of these lands are kind of shared. I mean, it didn't. And I tend to believe that if you were to go back in this pre-European time, the differentiation between the individual tribes would have been a little less and maybe more clan related, because at some point in time, and from my brain, I say that it goes way back, all of these groups spoke the same language. Iroquois is a language group, right? So there was some point in time when they were all together and they kind of, so it's a dynamic story, I think, is to say.
It's also not an old story. I want to make that clear.
Yes.
The exhibit is lovely.
Yeah.
But it to me, as for the Haudenosaunee, it implies that we're gone now. We're just a historical record.
Yep. Not the case at all.
Pottery and things like that, and that's not the case at all.
No, and actually I'm working with some other archaeologist friends of mine to document that there was no disappearance, in quotes here, which we believe we can lay out, because, and that's why I say these people didn't disappear, they just did the smart thing and got the heck out of the way a bunch of crazy white guys. I mean, that's.
Well, again, a lot of it was forced.
Yeah,
I mean,
forced.
you look back
No.
to the Mohawk Valley and you look back to the Clinton Sullivan
It was a
campaign,
turbulent
the slash
time.
and burn through the valley.
Yeah.
That was the breadbasket.
No, and we're
so
also
rich in that
on the
agriculture
edge
and
of
gone.
where you had the French and Indian conflict, a lot of conflict going on, those period of time was an incredibly turbulent, dynamic time. And you really, I would say that you really want the deep perspective is to try to dig deep, and I think the place to start is when you ask the nations their history.
Well, I just happened to bring some literature with me. Well, at home in Akwesasne, we have an organization called Akwesasne Travel.
Yes.
And it's fairly new, but it's a little more organized in terms of offering cultural experiences to people that are willing to travel. From here, I timed it with a little under 2 hours,
Yeah,
to drive.
I
straight
highly
down
recommend it, yeah.
37.
highly recommend it.
Again, a lovely drive too along
Yeah,
the
it is.
river.
Well, and you get to take in this whole terrain, this landscape, really, really get a feel for things, so. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's a short thing, but at the same time, there's artifacts found on Longsu that are 10,000 years old. So it really is a story of coming back to places or never leaving them, but it really is this kind of dynamic story. So thanks for sharing that. I'm glad you came today. This
Yeah,
young
me
lady's
too,
from
me too.
Akwesasne.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad I came. I
Yeah.
was looking forward to this.
Yeah, and give Darren my regards.
I will, he's my cousin.
Yeah, well, I didn't doubt it. Every time I say anything, get Darren, he says, well, that's my cousin.
You hear that a lot.
Yes, sir.
So is there virtually no written history of the indigenous peoples?
Well, I think you would find histories for each given nation has traditions and histories, but if you're talking specifically for this area, not really. We're trying to put together a story. I work with several historians from the nations. It's a riddle we want to solve on behalf of these folks, right?
Yeah.
Is it solvable in
It
your
is, I
estimation?
think it is. Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that our tradition has always been oral history.
Yep,
So the written history only started with the Jesuits.
right,
And
right.
of course, history is written from the side of the winner.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit skewed.
So,
you know.
yeah, you wanna take the Jesuits' relations and things like that with a really big grain of salt, probably a 6-pack of salt. So, cause yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the written history is very, very skewed, so you really gotta just pick little pearls of what maybe happened, not the perspective from that view. Because really, and that's something that we're trying to piece together, it really is. And even though, the way a collection like this came about wouldn't be how I would support now, put it that way. We have materials like this to help us learn. We have new technology, dating technologies and things like that, that will help us kind of figure this out. And more, now it's, folks like me, my colleague, we're collaborative with the nations, not telling the nations their history, which, some archaeologists are very much want to do. But no, it's not my history, it's their history. I'm just trying to help them reveal the heritage that was here, because it's a mystery, and I wanna know the answer. I wanna know everything. I wanna know how it happened. I wanna see history as a movie, right? I wanna sit there and watch a movie of that glacial lake retreating, the people, everything, right up until, that's just my brain, but that's kinda what drives me, but it's something. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, you said they found an ancient shoreline when this
Yes.
was underwater. You said it was back away, how far?
This was up on Fort Drum,
Oh, okay.
and it's at about 600 feet sea level, right? So one period of time, you could picture the Tug Hill Plateau is kind of an island almost, right? Because during the early part of this glacial lake, it wasn't flowing out up here, it was flowing through the Mohawk Valley, right? So Oneida Lake, Mohawk Valley, it was all going backwards, or well, not Mohawk wasn't, but the, the Oswego, all was going that way to the ocean, right? And then it's, give or take, sometime 13,000 years ago, plus or minus, probably plus, something happened and the ice let loose up here in the river, and all of a sudden it started running that way. And that that was the birth of our river. That's the first river, right? So we had several versions of our river, so. The one you see now only has been here for about 6,000 years. That's a while, but not as long as we've been out of the ice anyway. Anyway, anybody else got any questions you want to ask? Sure.
I just wondered, the term Haudenosaunee and Iroquois, is Haudenosaunee a more precise term for it?
Yes, it means people of the Longhouse, and it's what they called themselves, Dennis.
Yeah.
And that's why I refer to this, cause we call ourselves Americans, so I call people Americans, so they call themselves Haudenosaunee, that's who they are. Iroquoian is a language, and it's really, I know this young lady could probably speak better to this, cause I'm out of my league, but I know when it comes in general, the term Iroquois or even Indian, some people are offended, some aren't. I mean, I don't know, you're on your own. But I call them Haudenosaunee.
Yeah, I'm wildly offended by Indian.
Yeah, no, that's,
Wildly. And the use of the word Haudenosaunee, even in our communities, is an issue. I sit on the board of the Iroquois Museum. Get that?
okay, yep.
Down in the Mohawk Valley in Cobblestill. So I'm on the board, and that's a discussion we've been having, and I've been on the board for about 10 years or so it's been a while, because I used to live down there too. And I would say within the last year, we finally got rid of the word Indian. We were always legally known as the Iroquois Indian Museum, and it was just like a knife in my heart every time I saw
Yeah,
that,
I bet.
So it took a long time
Yeah.
to get that little word changed, like you have to apply to the Secretary of State, and you're putting
Yeah,
out
yeah.
papers, and all that, So finally it's gone.
That's
So now the new issue is, so how come we're still Iroquois then? How come we're not Haudenosaunee? Well, then within the Confederacy, that itself becomes a controversial word.
I was just gonna say, because it's in the name.
People spell it different, they read it different, they say it different, so, maybe another 10 years from now, we'll
Yeah,
resolve
oh
that
yeah.
issue.
Well, that's the thing, it's different depending on what side of the border you are, too.
Kinda, so I don't know how we're gonna resolve that.
It gets confusing to me, so I'll leave those matters to you folks.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
no, anyway,
Well, if I could just add
Yep.
just one thing, another museum worth looking at if you're traveling, if you're summer people and you've got the time to travel in the area, up in Onchayota, which is up near Saranac Lake,
Yep.
Placid. There's a new museum, which for many years was known as the Six Nations Indian Museum.
Yeah.
It has now again changed their name as well to
Yes.
Cultural Center, they're now the Cultural Center. So those name changes, maybe to somebody else are small and unimportant, but to us, you're talking about us.
yeah, no, it's,
So so the word Indian's gotta go.
yeah, I'm good with that. I just tell people, cause they ask me and I'm like, you're on your own, because I've had native people use the word, and then I've had some people that are really upset by it, and it's like, so I don't use the word, that's all.
Yeah.
Because I could totally understand it, so, but, yeah, and actually, most of the nations, I believe, have nice cultural centers that if you're in those parts of the state, please stop in and check them out.
Yeah, well then sometimes I think, well, how does people of India feel?
I'm not sure they're thinking about it. Anyway, folks, thanks so much for coming, and please step up and pick it up.